Hello, my name is Campbell and I'm the curator of Egypt and Sudan at Manchester Museum, and asked to talk about the subject of materiality and representation in ancient Egypt actually quite appealed to me because my PhD thesis at Liverpool University had materiality in the title. So it's a pleasure to give you a short summary of some of my thoughts about how materiality and representation operated in ancient Egypt. So ancient Egypt is a long time, northeast corner of Africa. The civilization, as we know it, pharaonic civilization, starts around 3000 BCE and lasts to about 30 BCE with the death of Cleopatra. And when we think of ancient Egyptian art, we think of this highly stylized, rather colourful, quite appealing, but also slightly mysterious way of showing the world. Often including people. And so the human form, men, women, and children, do feature as a central aspect of Egyptian representation. That is because a lot of representational material comes from Egyptian tombs and is concerned about the afterlife and projecting an idealized vision of the afterlife into eternity. And because a lot of other images come from temples, and those are for the celebration of the gods and the king, and rely heavily on the representation of those figures. So this is a kind of ideal scene in every sense. It's ideal to talk about, and it's highly idealized. These are not snapshots. These are not family Polaroids that you take on a day out. Although that, to be fair, is how they've often been described in Egyptology in previous generations. Now we realize that these are highly stylized, filtered through a number of different lenses of decorum, what is appropriate to depict. So just from this instance, this is from a private tomb, around about 1400 BCE, now in the British Museum. So the main figure, Nebamun, is a very important member of the royal court. He's shown hunting in the marshes. He's got a throw stick, but this is in every way laden with symbolism and significance. It shows Nebamun as an agent of Ma'at, the goodness or rightness or justice in the universe, overcoming chaos represented by these birds in the marshes. Spearing in the marshes is an euphemism for sexual congress, so it's no surprise that his lady wife, in her equivalent of Sunday best, is shown on this little papyrus skiff in a highly unrealistic depiction of what one might actually get up to in a Nilotic marsh. It shows the world as hyper real. So the people are perfect, generic images of themselves. These are not portraits at all. They don't show any flaws. They don't show any physical imperfections. The marsh is rich. It's full of wildlife. There are plenty of fish in the river underneath. This is a hyper real representation of reality because this was depicted in the tomb chapel. On some level, it was meant to impress people that visited the tomb chapel, but also because whatever was depicted in 2 or 3 dimensions in ancient Egypt was real, it was valid for eternity. As long as it had an inscription with it, identifying the key players, in some sense, those images, those representations could be animated by an aspect of the spirit. And so the spirits of the deceased people could partake in the scenes in some way of what was depicted. Now, a key idea, without getting too arcane about this, in ancient Egypt is there are 2 types of time. There is nechech time. I've given you the hieroglyphs there on the left, and that is cyclical time. So day and night, the lunar cycle, the solar cycle, the seasons. These are things which go around and come around again. So they're a part of a cycle of life. Whereas there is another kind of time, jet time, which is linear time. It's the time of the gods. It goes on into the future. So just to look at an image of Egypt, this is south of Egypt, around Thebes, major city, modern Luxor, life in Egypt dominated by the Nile, which represents the cycle. So Nechech time, where people live, tends to be near the river, because most people in ancient times, if not quite so much today, were farmers. And so there's this strip of green, strip of cultivation, strip of life next to the river. But then up beyond the cultivation, and you can really stand with 1 foot in the cultivation and 1 foot in the desert in Egypt, there is the desert, and it is the time, the place of the gods. That's where you find tombs, especially on the western side where the sun sets. That's the time of the gods stretching into eternity. So again, just to illustrate it, pyramids have this incredible influence on the modern concept of ancient Egypt. And often people assume they're out in the middle of the desert and no one can see them. If you've been to Egypt, you know that there's a significant modern conurbation. They were linked to the land they were linked to the cultivation of the land by decorated avenues, causeways. And so pyramids, as opposed to the settled and flooded land, as here, there used to be an annual flood in Egypt before the Aswan High Dam was raised in the 1960s. Here you have the life of the land, where the cycle of life goes on, but then in the distance you have the pyramids, jet time, and these areas, the areas of pyramids, monuments, gods, temples, these are the arena of representation for the most part, or at least representation that survives. And man, indeed, as the Arabic proverb says, fears time, but time fears the pyramids. But one little point about representation, about the materiality of representation, is this linear time, jet time, has a homophone, a word that sounds the same, in the form of jet, body or bodily form or self. You can talk about yourself. And I think this gets to the heart of the idea that after death, particularly, the spirit can use a material form. It needs a statue or a two-dimensional carving or painting, properly captioned, to be able to exist as a non-material being for eternity. And so this is why the human image dominates surviving evidence of ancient Egypt, because there were lots of rich people. This doesn't apply to the non-elite, we don't know about them, but the rich of ancient Egypt wanted to perpetuate an elite existence. And so you get this idealized, to us rather stilted, rather stiff, rather awkward way of depicting the human figure, with 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 eye, but the features of the side of the face. The reason these representations are so familiar is because they were tightly controlled by this system of decorum, and controlled in terms of their transmission. So there was a kind of standard set of grid proportions that was almost always adhered to in pharaonic times, and this was replicated again and again and again. So that is why Egyptian art, which lasted for 3,000 years, pharaonic art, and which is so common in museums and in sites in Egypt today, and in photographs and documentaries, why it's so instantly recognizable as an Egyptian representation. Show someone in the street a Persian representation or a Mesoamerican representation, and they will not have the same cachet, they won't have the same kudos, they won't have the same recognizability as pharaonic art. But fundamentally, as I say, the purpose of these images is to allow, in kind of crude terms, an alternative body for the deceased. Of course, it's hoped that the body itself is somewhat turned into a statue. Mummification, far from simply being about preserving the features, as we often tend to imagine, is about turning the body or the deceased into a god and the body into a statue. And gods dwell in jet time, the time of eternity, and they need to occupy or be present in here within these images that are to last for eternity, because gods are immortal and deceased people want to be immortal too. So that is why the image is of such importance for the elite, for the king, for the gods. That's why it's represented again and again. But I must stress again, especially to a non-Egyptological audience, that the key fundamental understanding of Egyptian art is hieroglyphic. Statues, reliefs are essentially three-dimensional hieroglyphs. And so the figures of people can be used as determinative signs at the end of hieroglyphic inscriptions. So here, the name of this king's son, this royal prince, Ra-Hotep, one would expect a figure of him directly after himself, as his wife, the lady Nofret, is here shown as a little figure of herself at the end of the hieroglyphic word for her name. But the statues themselves act as three-dimensional determinatives. They represent the ideal, the elite ideal. For men, that is a darker brown skin. For women, it's lighter skin. This is not what people actually looked like. It's not because men were out in the fields working and toiling away in the direct sunshine. It is simply a hieroglyphic distinguisher between male and female. There's a kind of gender binary there, as in other things. But these are, as I say, three-dimensional hieroglyphs. People didn't actually look like this. They simply want to be represented like this for eternity. So it's really not until the Romans, maybe the Greeks, start really settling in Egypt that there is a flavor for verism, for the depiction of the human face, at least, if not the body, as it might actually have been recognized, what we might call a mimetic likeness. But for the ancient Egyptians, it was far more important that the materials were appropriate. If a statue was wooden, it tended to be painted to emulate other materials. If a statue was stone, as here, these are stone covered in plaster and paint. These are depictions that really rely on their materiality. That's the key thing. And often we see, well, occasionally we see depictions which seem to show corrections, like this bust of a royal face from the site of Amarna now in Berlin. And it looks like they're trying to correct images of what people actually look like. Recent studies have shown these are almost mathematical in their precision about how they depict the face. They don't have a direct referent in the real human observable face of real living biological people. And just finally, because this is what my PhD thesis was on, I looked at the materiality of non-royal statues in temples. And this is my favorite example to just show you how statues work and how materiality works in ancient Egypt. This is a depiction of a person, and it was donated in the name of a guy called Jedhor. But it does not simply represent Jedhor himself. That is a simplification. It represents the idea of a person, and a person who can heal other people. It is also simply the typical image of an elite person at this period as a statue. In front of the figure is this image of the naked child god Horus, the son of Horus, so the son of Isis and Osiris, who makes up this great trinity in Egyptian religion. And so the innocent child Horus is often shown overcoming adversity and danger. So he's shown trampling on crocodiles, grasping snakes and scorpions and dangerous animals. And the idea is you would pour liquid water, perhaps over this figure. It is completely covered, apart from the face, in magical spells against scorpion stings and snake bites. And by the act of pouring the water would absorb the intention of those spells, the magic of those spells, the materiality of the statue, and you could drink the water or apply it to an injury and it would help heal you. Recently described as working somewhat like a magical tea bag. But that is essentially, it gets to the heart of how the ancient Egyptians thought materials worked, they thought images worked, they thought representations worked, not simply by replicating nature as they saw it, people or animals or plants, but by operating on a very distinctive register of representation that doesn't simply relate to our modern Western ideas of the image or representationalism. So if you get any more questions about representation and materiality in ancient Egypt, I'd be very happy to answer them. I'm on social media, so just give me a shout. Thanks.